My name is Walter Greer, and I am 64 years old, and for the last 6 months, I have been the most convincing fool in the state of Ohio. It wasn't hard. People see a widower in his 60s, a little slower than he used to be, a little quieter at the dinner table, and they start filling in the blanks themselves. They decide you're fading, they decide the lights are dimming. My nephew decided all of that about 8 months ago, right around the time he learned I had sold my trucking company for $22 million. Let me tell you what happened the night I invited him to my house to sign what he thought were the papers that would give him everything. I need to back up first, because none of this makes sense without understanding who Thomas is and who I am, and how we got to a place where family became something I had to defend myself against. I spent 31 years building Greer Freight Solutions out of a 2-truck operation in Dayton into one of the largest regional carriers in the Midwest. My wife Carol kept the books for the first decade, working at the kitchen table after our daughters went to bed, running numbers on a legal pad until midnight. She was the one who told me to take the contract with the auto parts manufacturer in Toledo that changed everything. She was the one who hired our first real accountant, our first dispatcher, our first safety coordinator. She built that company with me, just as much as I did, maybe more, because she did it while also raising 2 daughters and being the kind of woman people wanted to be around. Carol died 19 months ago, pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to the end, and I have not fully understood any day since. Thomas is my late brother's son. My brother Raymond passed 11 years ago, a heart attack at 53, and after that, I tried to be present for Thomas the way Raymond would have wanted. I paid for 2 years of his college before he dropped out. I gave him a job at Greer Freight in the dispatch office, which lasted 14 months before I had to let him go for falsifying delivery logs. I did not tell anyone in the family the real reason. I said the position was eliminated. Raymond's memory deserved that much. Thomas had been drifting for years after that. Sales jobs that never lasted. A landscaping business that folded after 1 season. A girlfriend situation that produced a child he rarely saw. He had Raymond's jaw and Raymond's laugh, and absolutely none of Raymond's character. When I sold the company in March, I did not announce it publicly. But these things get around in a city the size of Dayton. By April, Thomas had started calling me every week. Checking in, he said, making sure I was doing okay. Worried about me rattling around alone in this big house. He started coming by for dinner. He brought his girlfriend, a woman named Denise, who smiled too much and asked careful questions about whether I had a financial advisor and whether my daughters were nearby. My daughters, Ruth and Patricia, live in Denver and Raleigh, respectively. They visit when they can. They call often. But they are not in the next room, and Thomas knew that. The first real warning came from my accountant, a woman named Shirley who has handled my finances since 2009. Thomas had called her office, identifying himself as my nephew, and asking general questions about estate planning and whether I had considered setting up a trust. Shirley called me immediately. "That's strange," I told her. "I never mentioned you to him." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm calling you, instead of answering him." I thanked her and hung up, and I sat in Carol's chair in the living room, the one by the window she used to read in, and I thought about what Thomas was actually doing. I called my attorney the next morning. His name is Dale Hutchins, and he has been my lawyer for 18 years. He is a careful man who does not use 2 words where one will do, and when I explained the situation, he was quiet for a moment before he said, "We should look into this more carefully." What Dale found over the following weeks was not surprising, but it was clarifying. Thomas had debts, significant ones. Credit cards maxed to their limits, a personal loan from a finance company that charged 21% interest, back rent on the apartment he shared with Denise, and an outstanding judgment from a contractor he had stiffed for work on a truck he no longer owned. His total exposure was somewhere around $90,000. Not enormous in the abstract, but enormous for a man with no income and no prospects. Dale also found something else. Thomas had been consulting with a paralegal service, the kind that is not quite a law firm but sells legal document packages to people who don't want to pay attorney rates. He had downloaded and partially filled out forms for a durable power of attorney and a guardianship petition, the kind of paperwork you file when you want to take over someone's financial and medical decisions. I read those documents at Dale's office, with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. The forms had my name on them, Walter James Greer, already filled in. I set the papers down and looked at Dale. "He's been planning this for a while," I said. "At least since the sale," Dale said. "Probably longer." We sat with that for a minute. "What do we want to do?" Dale asked. I thought about Raymond. I thought about the 14 months Thomas worked for me and how I covered for him when I fired him, how I protected his reputation because I loved his father. I thought about Carol, who had always been cooler about Thomas than I was, who had said once, gently, that kindness without accountability wasn't really kindness. "I want him to try," I said, "and then I want it documented." Dale nodded slowly. "That's a harder road." "I know," I said. "Let's take it." The plan was mine, but Dale executed it. We hired a private investigator named Frank Adler, a retired sheriff's deputy from Greene County who had the kind of face that made you feel like he'd already heard every lie you were planning to tell. Frank put surveillance on Thomas for 3 weeks. We got what we needed faster than I expected. The important piece came on a Tuesday afternoon in early September. Thomas met with a man named Gerald Poole at a diner in Kettering. Gerald Poole had an Ohio social work license that was currently under review for misconduct. He had testified in 4 guardianship cases in the past 2 years, always on behalf of the petitioner, always finding that the elderly subject lacked sufficient mental capacity to manage their affairs. He was, in the plainest terms, a man who sold favorable evaluations to people who needed them. Frank photographed the meeting. He got audio using equipment that was entirely legal under Ohio's one-party consent laws. Thomas and Gerald sat in a corner booth for 40 minutes. Thomas described me as increasingly confused, prone to repeating stories, losing track of finances. He said I had recently asked him what month it was. He said I had called him by his father's name twice in one conversation. None of that was true. I had not done any of those things. But I understood now what the script was going to be. After that meeting, I started giving Thomas material to work with. When he called, I repeated myself deliberately. When he visited, I left a pile of unopened mail on the kitchen counter and acted vague about whether I had looked at it. I told him the same story about a fishing trip with Raymond twice in one evening, watching his eyes each time I repeated it. The second time, he glanced at Denise and gave the smallest nod. That was the confirmation I needed. 3 weeks after the diner meeting, Thomas called me on a Sunday night. His voice had that careful, concerned warmth he had been practicing. "Uncle Walt," he said, "Denise and I have been really worried about you. We've been talking to someone who works with families in situations like yours, someone who helps make sure everything is organized properly. We'd love to come by this week and just have a conversation, nothing formal, just to make sure you're taken care of." I let my voice sound a little uncertain, a little tired. "That sounds fine, Thomas. I've been feeling scattered lately. Maybe that would help." He said, "Wednesday at 6. I said that was fine. After I hung up, I called Dale. "Wednesday," I said. He said, "Good." He said he'd be ready. The 2 days before Wednesday, I did not sleep particularly well, but not because I was afraid. I was thinking about Raymond. I was thinking about what it would have done to him to know his son had become this. I was thinking about Carol, who would have handled this with more grace than I was managing, who would have found a way to be sad about it rather than angry, and who was right about almost everything. Wednesday evening arrived, gray and cold, the kind of October evening that makes Ohio feel like the sky is made of concrete. I had a fire going in the living room and the lights turned down a little, comfortable, warm. The kind of environment where an old man might feel at ease and a predator might feel confident. Thomas and Denise arrived at 6:02. With them was a man I had never met, introduced as Dr. Marcus Webb, a specialist in elder care transitions. He had silver hair, a very good suit, a handshake that was precisely calibrated between authoritative and gentle, and eyes that were doing a quiet assessment of everything in the room from the moment he walked in. His real name, as Dale had established, was Gerald Poole. I played the part I had been rehearsing. I shook his hand and looked at him a beat too long, the way someone might when they are trying to place a face they don't recognize. I offered everyone coffee, and then forgot to start the pot until Thomas reminded me. I sat in the armchair by the window and folded my hands in my lap and looked between their faces with an expression of gentle, cooperative confusion. "Uncle Walt," Thomas said, settling into the couch across from me, with the deliberate comfort of someone who is getting ready to take something from you. "We're not here to pressure you about anything. We just want to make sure that as things get a little more complicated, you've got the right support around you." I nodded slowly. "That's very thoughtful." Gerald Poole, going by Dr. Webb, leaned forward in his chair. "Walter, your nephew tells me you've had some difficulty lately with day-to-day tasks, managing correspondence, keeping track of appointments. Is that something you've noticed yourself?" I looked at the middle distance for a moment, the way someone might if the question required more effort than it should. "I suppose," I said. "Carol used to handle so much. I find I rely on her, and then remember she's not here. I let that land." I watched Thomas receive it. He gave a small, sympathetic smile. "That's very common after a loss," Gerald said. "It's actually one of the reasons we recommend getting a support structure in place sooner rather than later. When someone has significant assets and they're navigating grief at the same time, it can become difficult to make clear-headed decisions. The intention isn't to take anything away from you. It's to make sure there's someone looking out for your interests." "My interests," I repeated, keeping my voice soft. Thomas reached into the bag he had brought. He pulled out a folder and placed it on the coffee table between us, turning it so it faced me. There were papers inside with tabbed markers on the signature lines. I recognized the structure immediately. Dale and I had reviewed identical forms 3 weeks ago. "These are just preliminary documents," Thomas said. "Nothing gets filed until everyone agrees. But Dr. Webb needs to do a brief evaluation first, just so we have something on record that shows this was done thoughtfully." "An evaluation?" I said. "Just a conversation, really," Gerald said. "A few questions to establish a baseline. Nothing to worry about." I looked at the papers on the table. I looked at the tabs. Then I looked at Thomas. And for just a moment I let myself see him the way Carol always saw him. Not Raymond's son, not family, but someone who had made a choice and was in the process of living it out. I reached forward, and very slowly, I picked up the folder. Thomas straightened slightly. Gerald shifted forward. Denise, who had been quiet the whole time, leaned in just a fraction. I turned the folder over in my hands, then I set it back down. "Thomas," I said, and my voice was different now, not uncertain, not tired. His eyes changed. "I'd like to ask you something," I said. "When you met with Gerald at the Frisch's in Kettering on September the 14th, did you discuss what you'd need him to say on the evaluation? Or did you leave that open-ended?" The room went completely still. Thomas's face did something I had not seen it do before. The warmth drained out of it all at once, like water through a pulled drain, and what was left underneath was something careful and cold and calculating, and I understood that I was seeing his actual face for possibly the first time in my life. "Uncle Walt," he started. "Frank," I said. The door to the hallway opened. Frank Adler came out first, holding a digital recorder. Behind him came Dale Hutchins. Behind Dale came 2 men in plain clothes whose badges were already visible on their belts. Gerald Poole stood up so fast his chair scraped backward on the hardwood. His Dr. Webb composure was gone entirely. He looked at the badges, and then at Thomas, and his professional affect collapsed into something much more ordinary and much more frightened. Thomas did not stand. He sat on my couch and looked at me with an expression I will spend some time thinking about. It was not anger, though anger came later. It was something closer to disbelief, as though he had made a reasonable set of assumptions about what kind of man I was, and the data was not matching. The detective on the left, a woman named Carver, who had the patient economy of motion that comes from doing difficult things for a long time, looked at the documents on the coffee table, looked at Gerald Poole, looked at Thomas. "Mr. Greer," she said to Thomas, "we'd like to speak with you and Mr. Poole separately." "Is there another room available?" I gestured toward the dining room. "Of course," I said. "Take your time." Denise had not said a single word. She sat on the far end of the couch with her coat still on and her hands in her lap, and she looked at Thomas with an expression that was not loyalty, and I thought that whatever she had believed she was walking into tonight, this was not it. Thomas was taken into the dining room. Gerald Poole, who gave up the pretense of the name Webb within approximately 4 seconds of seeing the detectives, was walked to the kitchen. Dale stayed with me in the living room. Frank stood near the door. The evaluations took almost 2 hours. At one point, Thomas's voice rose in the dining room and then dropped again. Gerald was quiet for most of it. When they came back through the living room to leave, Thomas stopped near the door. He looked at me with something that had organized itself into anger now, clean and uncomplicated. "This is your family," he said. "You did this to your own family." I looked at him for a moment. "Raymond was my family," I said. "I'm still not sure what you are." He left. The door closed. The house was quiet except for the fire. Dale sat down across from me. "You doing all right?" I thought about it genuinely. I wasn't entirely all right. There was nothing satisfying about it the way people might expect. No triumph. Just the particular exhaustion that comes when something you hoped was not true turns out to be exactly as true as you feared. "Ask me in a few days," I said. He nodded. "That's a reasonable answer." The legal process moved at the pace legal processes move, which is to say slowly and with extensive paperwork. Thomas was charged with elder financial abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted unauthorized practice of law for filing preliminary guardianship documentation with falsified supporting evidence. Gerald Poole, whose license situation was already troubled before this, faced charges of fraud and impersonation, and the DA's office had reached out to 3 other counties where his testimony had been used in guardianship cases. Those families were now getting second looks at what had been done to them. Thomas's attorney got him a plea arrangement, 18 months, suspended to probation given no prior criminal record, with a requirement to make restitution for legal costs and to complete financial crime counseling. I was consulted about the plea, and I agreed to it. Not because I forgave him, but because I thought about what 30 months in a state facility would produce, and it was not a better version of Thomas. It was just an angrier one. Gerald Poole did not get a plea. He went to trial. The audio from the Kettering diner, the photographs, and the testimony of 2 previous families he had evaluated combined into a case that the jury resolved in 4 hours. He received 3 years and the permanent revocation of his social work credentials. I sat in the courtroom for both proceedings. I sat in the same seat toward the back, where I could see clearly without being the first thing either of them looked at. When the verdicts came in, I did not feel the particular satisfaction people expect you to feel at those moments. What I felt was something quieter and harder to name. Something like the end of a chapter you had hoped would go differently. There is a thing that happens after you survive something like this. A specific kind of loneliness that is different from ordinary grief, because you cannot fully explain it to people who were not there. You cannot say to your daughters, "Something happened to me, and it involved your cousin and the legal system and 6 months of pretending to lose my mind," and have them understand it the way it actually felt from the inside. You can give them the facts, and I did, over long phone calls that left both of them shaken, and Ruth angry in a way she was still processing months later. But the interior of the experience, the specific texture of sitting in your own living room and watching someone you helped raise look at you like you were an asset to be liquidated, that part stays with you alone. Patricia flew in for a week in November. She is the quieter of my 2 daughters, the one who processes things internally before she speaks. She sat with me at the kitchen table on her second day there and asked me if I was angry. "Not the way I expected to be," I told her. "What way did you expect?" "I thought I'd feel it more like a fire," I said. "It's more like a stone." She thought about that. She has Carol's way of thinking carefully before she responds. "Dad," she said finally, "did you know before you set the trap that you were going to go through with it? That you weren't going to just confront him and be done?" I thought about it honestly. "No," I said. "I thought for a while about just calling him, telling him I knew, and letting that be the end of it. But I kept thinking about the other families, the ones Gerald had already evaluated, the ones where there was no Dale, no Frank, no 6 months of documentation, just an elderly person and a piece of paper, and someone who had decided they didn't matter anymore." Patricia nodded. "That's what Mom would have said," she said. "I know," I said. "That's partly why I did it." The thing I have not talked about publicly, the part that sat with me longer than the trial and longer than the verdict, was a conversation I had with Thomas about 2 months after sentencing. He called me. I almost did not pick up. He did not apologize the way people apologize when they want to be forgiven. He apologized the way people apologize when they have had time to actually look at what they did. It was halting and unpolished, and at one point he stopped talking for almost 20 seconds, and I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. "I don't know how to explain it," he said eventually. "I kept telling myself it was just money, that you had more than you needed, that you weren't using it." "That's not an explanation," I said. "That's a justification." "I know. There's a difference. I know, Uncle Walt." We were quiet for a moment. "Your father would have been devastated," I said. "Not because of the money, because of what it says about who you decided to become." He didn't respond to that. I don't know what I expected him to say. I told him I would not be calling him. I told him I was not going to pretend this was something that could be repaired with a conversation. But I also told him that I was not spending whatever years I had left carrying hatred for Raymond's son, because Raymond didn't deserve that, even if Thomas did. He said he understood. I said I hoped so. We hung up, and I sat for a while in the quiet house, and I thought about the weight of things you can put down and the weight of things that stay. After Carol died, I thought retirement would mean stillness. I thought it would mean mornings without agenda and afternoons that belonged to no one. And it does mean some of that, some days. But the experience with Thomas changed something in how I thought about what the money was for. I called Shirley, my accountant, in January. I told her I wanted to establish a fund, something with a specific purpose, something that could provide legal and investigative resources to elderly people in Ohio who suspected they were being exploited by family members but could not afford the kind of infrastructure I had access to. Shirley said she thought it was a good use. I called Dale. He said he'd been thinking the same thing since September. We spent 3 months organizing it. We filed the nonprofit paperwork in March, almost exactly a year after I had sold the company. We called it the Greer Family Fund, which is both true and ironic in a way that I have come to appreciate. We hired 2 staff attorneys, a part-time investigator, and a social worker with 30 years of experience in elder care advocacy. We set up a phone line. The first call came in on a Tuesday from a woman in Columbus whose daughter-in-law had convinced her to sign documents she hadn't understood and whose bank account had already been partially emptied. The second call came that same week from a man in Springfield who had not spoken to his son in 2 months because the son had installed himself as a gatekeeper between his father and everyone the father knew. We could not fix everything. Some situations had already progressed too far before anyone called. Some families did not want intervention even when intervention was clearly needed. The law has limits, and so do we. But we helped the woman in Columbus. She got her money back, and her daughter-in-law entered a diversion program. She sent us a card at Christmas with a photograph of her grandchildren that she was now permitted to see freely. That photograph is on my desk. Some mornings I sit in Carol's chair by the window with a cup of coffee, and I look at what this house has become. It is still too quiet in the specific way that a house is quiet when the person who made it alive is no longer in it. That is not something that fixes. But there are phone calls now, and cases, and the particular satisfaction of watching a frightened person realize that someone with resources and resolve is standing next to them. Last week, a man came into the office. He was in his 30s, holding a folder tightly to his chest, and he had the look of someone who has been told twice already that nothing can be done and is trying one more time anyway. His grandmother, he said. Her new husband had isolated her from the family, was controlling her finances, had moved her to a town 3 hours from anyone she knew. He had tried the county elder services office. He had tried a legal aid clinic. He had been told the situation was civil, that without proof of abuse it was difficult to intervene, that these things take time. I asked him to sit down. He sat. He laid out everything he knew, everything he had documented, every text message and every phone call and every visit where he had been turned away at the door. When he finished, I picked up the phone and called Frank Adler. "We have a new case," I said. "Are you available?" Frank said he was. I hung up and looked at the young man across the desk. "We're going to help your grandmother," I said. "That's not a promise I make lightly, and it doesn't mean it'll be easy, but we're going to try." He exhaled. His shoulders dropped in the way that shoulders drop when someone has been holding something alone for too long. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet, I said. Tell me everything again, from the beginning, and this time leave nothing out. He nodded and started talking, and I listened the way you learn to listen when you understand that the details other people think are small are almost always the ones that matter. I am 64 years old. I built something over 3 decades, and then I sold it, and then someone tried to take the rest. They failed, not because I was lucky, but because I had spent a long time learning that patience is not passivity, and that the most powerful thing a person can be is quietly, absolutely certain of what they know. Thomas was wrong about a lot of things, but the most important thing he was wrong about was this. He looked at a man in his 60s, a man who had lost his wife and sold his company, and was sitting alone in a house full of her absence, and he saw someone whose story was mostly finished. He saw a closing chapter. He did not understand that some people don't get quieter when they lose things. Some people get clearer. I am one of those people. And if you are sitting somewhere tonight, listening to this, because someone in your life is trying to make you feel small, trying to make you feel like your mind is failing or your judgment can't be trusted, trying to position themselves between you and your own life, I want you to hear this directly from someone who has been exactly where you are. You are not finished. You know more than they think you know. And the moment they convince themselves you've already lost, that is precisely when the advantage shifts back to you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. Tell me if this story felt familiar. Tell me if there's someone in your life you're not sure you can trust. I read every one of them, and I take every one of them seriously. My name is Walter Greer. I'm 64 years old, and I am just getting started.